In terms of general concepts, one thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that when a person decides to use the meditative approach to deal with the issue of compulsive eating, there are some enormous advantages. On the other hand, one has to admit that it is very challenging. So there's sort of good news and bad news. So I'll give you the good news first. The good news is that when a person is successful with the eating issue using the meditative technique, they have not merely learned to cope with the eating issue, because the meditative technique works on a very broad spectrum, so that the person has learned, in fact, to deal with the issue of compulsiveness or neediness or drivenness per se. Any kind of neediness, any kind of compulsiveness, any kind of drivenness. Not just the neediness or drivenness or compulsiveness that relates to the issue of food. So that when a person works in the meditative way around this issue, the result that they get is an enormous transformation of every aspect of their life, not just one aspect. Because as a person gradually diminishes the driven forces within themselves in this global way, all the driven forces, then that person begins to approach what in the Buddhist tradition is called nirvana. Now, some of you may have heard that word before. Unfortunately, in ordinary usage, in English nowadays, when people say nirvana, it implies some sort of exceedingly blissed out, spaced out state, correct? Isn't that sort of the connotation of that word? But in fact, please bear in mind that nirvana is a highly technical term, very precisely defined within the Buddhist tradition. It has nothing to do per se with any states of being blissed out or spaced out. It is rather the effortless, spontaneous, totally fulfilled, moment by moment, unconditional freedom that is experienced by a person who has worked through the issue of drivenness per se. In other words, nirvana is what ordinary life looks like to a person who has become effortless the way nature is effortless. This is a profound spiritual experience. In essence, it is an abiding state of heaven on earth, you might say. Each time you turn your head, it seems that you're looking at paradise. Each moment is completely fulfilling to you and free. This is the state of consciousness, the ordinary life of the person who has worked through the issue of drivenness per se. In other words, it is the drivenness that represents the veil that separates us from our spiritual ground of being. So this is a tremendous advantage. In some approaches to the whole issue of eating or food, the interest is in the one particular issue, the behavior around the food. But in the meditative approach, the behavior around the food is seen in a much broader context and dealt with with a much more universal tool, so that when you finally do become successful, you have experienced a total transformation of all aspects of your life, and indeed become another kind of being, literally, the kind of being that you've read about in the great spiritual classics of the world. So that's a tremendous advantage, something very much to recommend the meditative approach. On the other hand, it has to be pointed out that the meditative approach requires an enormous commitment and enormous consistency in one's practice for it to work. So the good news is not only can a person use meditation to become free from the compulsiveness, but they will become free from compulsiveness around food, but in doing so they will attain a spiritual transformation. That's the good news. The bad news is you have to really want it, and you have to work consistently. There's another part to the good news, which is that the meditative approach roots out the cause of compulsiveness, so that eventually the abstinence can be maintained, or the proper diet, whatever it is for that person, it can be maintained without effort, without struggle. It is completely effortless. That's another part of the good news, okay? What characterizes the meditative approach to an issue like eating, as opposed to other approaches, is that in the meditative approach, one purposefully and in a very disciplined and consistent way cultivates states of unusual high concentration power. And without those states of concentration power, one cannot really apply a meditative strategy. So you're all familiar with a microscope, aren't you? You've seen them. You know what they do. Microscopes magnify and increase one's ability to observe with precision, with detail. What most people do not realize is that what we might call attentiveness or mindfulness or focusing power, this is to our subjective internal world what the microscope is to the external world. And you can go out and purchase a microscope that will give you just about any magnification you want, correct? It's true, isn't it? Magnify 10 times, 100 times, 1,000 times. And all you have to do to get that magnifying, it's called resolving power, the ability to penetrate down into the subtle. In order to attain visual resolving power, all you have to do is plunk down enough money to buy a good enough microscope. But how about psychological resolving power? How about the power to observe one's own internal processes at greater and greater magnifications? That power is also available to any person that wants it. But there is a price. It's not monetary, though. Okay, you pay for your microscope, your optical magnifying instrument. You pay with money. What is the price that you pay in order to develop an internal microscope that will allow you to examine at all the different levels the deep structure of your own mind and body? What is the price for the internal microscope? Huh? Time and effort. How much time and effort? Well, let me put it this way. You don't have to go off to a monastery in Tibet. Okay? You don't have to shave your head. I would say about the same amount of time and effort that a person puts into a really serious hobby or avocation. Say you wanted to get good at the piano, for example, or a game of tennis. What kind of time and energy are we talking about? Well, you'd have to practice on the piano. You wouldn't seriously expect to get good at the piano without, what, an hour's practice each day, maybe? And are you going to be able to do it in a week? No. A month? Well, you'll make a start in a month. You'd give yourself 6 months, a year, several years, wouldn't you? And you practice an hour a day, and maybe every once in a while you'd have jam sessions and rehearsals. You'd go many hours, right? Okay. That's the amount of time and effort you'd need to put in. Those of you that are laughing understand the metaphor, okay? The jam sessions and rehearsals are what we call retreats. They're when people come and they spend a whole day meditating or a half day meditating or a weekend meditating. And the daily sitting that a person does, that's their playing the scales in their formal practice. About the same amount of time and energy that a person would put into the endeavor of learning how to play the piano well or really mastering some game, that same amount of time and energy put towards the skill, to cultivate the skill of concentration and focus power, will allow you to be successful. You'll be able to do it. And that's the price that nature asks. It's not an exorbitant price when you compare it to the product that you're being given. Okay? The difficulty is that most people don't really realize that this potential is available to them. They don't realize. You see lots of people playing the piano. You see pianos sold everywhere, everywhere you go. So everybody accepts in this culture a person can learn to play the piano. It's not so abundantly evident that a person can master the focusing power of the mind, but we can. So that's the amount of time and energy that is required. If you are willing to put in that amount of time and energy, you can develop your focusing power, your concentration power, to be twice, 3 times, 4 times as great as it is right now. Once you have done that, you have acquired the tool that you need to approach the eating issue, or indeed any compulsive issue, from a meditative perspective. One more sort of broad thing that I'd like to talk about, general principle, before I get into specific technique, is that a person that has, let us say, a real serious compulsive problem around something, a quote disorder or compulsion, could be around eating, could be around some form of sexual experience, it could be around some other substance. The person that has a severe problem, or a person that has, let's say, a phobia, an irrational fear like fear of flying or something like that. From one perspective, we can say that such a person is very much should be our object of compassion. It's a sad thing. A person's life can be utterly devastated by an irrational fear or a compulsion. However, from another point of view, we could say that that person is fortunate. Is that shocking to hear that? From what point of view is that person fortunate? Anybody have an idea? Yes.
That person may eventually seek help, which will lead them into a new.
Well, I think that's sort of the direction. In a sense, what is happening is that nature is forcing that person to have a transcendent experience. The person that has a severe compulsive issue in their life that is much larger than ordinary should not think that they are more compulsive per se than other people. That is not necessarily true at all. It is only true that the general pool of compulsiveness has become concentrated around a specific kind of experience, whereas in other people it may be distributed among many things. Okay? So you might say that from a certain point of view, the person that has a severe compulsive issue is fortunate in 2 ways. First of all, in order to just have their life together, they are being forced to deal with the issue of compulsiveness, whereas the people that have their compulsiveness distributed can sort of eke by, you might say, squeak by, because doesn't really wreck their lives. But they are every bit as compulsive as the compulsive overeater or the drug user. It's just that the compulsions are all distributed, they're sort of evened out, so you're not aware how terribly driven you are. The second way that the person could be said to be fortunate is that the issue has been, so to speak, brought to a head where it's very, very clear and constantly in front of them. So that all you have to do to become if you're, let's say, a compulsive eater or a compulsive, you have an addiction to a substance or something like that, all you have to do to become an enlightened person, a totally spiritual being, is to deal with that one very, very highlighted and clear issue, but to deal with it in a meditative way. If you merely suspend the behavior without reaching down with extraordinary concentration into the source of the behavior, you will not experience a spiritual transformation. You will experience abstinence with effort for your whole life. But if you apply the great states of concentration to penetrating down into the source of the compulsiveness, then you have the entire block to spiritual experience has been concentrated and highlighted and brought to total clarity right in front of you, and all you have to do, and it's there every day, maybe every minute, and all you have to do is keep working at that one little spot, okay? And that will be the spot that you can poke through to transcendent awareness. Most of you have probably heard of Zen practice, the Zen school of Buddhism, right? Those of you that are new to the center have probably at least heard that. And you may know that in Zen, they use something called a koan, K-O-A-N, which is sort of like an impossible question that they ask you, like, show me the sound of one hand clapping now, okay? Or before heaven and earth were born, what did your original face look like? Or moo, just moo, bring me moo. Doesn't make any sense, right? What would you do if I demanded that you show me your original face, and I demanded that like every day from you? Made you come to me 3 times a day and demanded you to answer a question you couldn't answer. Well, what this strategy is designed to do, this koan strategy, is very frustrating, right? Don't you think it would get frustrating after a little while, trying to answer a question you couldn't understand? Wouldn't it get rather confusing after a little while? And by the way, as you started to give answers, I would respond in such a way as to confuse you and frustrate you even more, okay? What's the point? Have any of you read about this kind of training? What's the point? Why do that? The point is that what that kind of prodding does is it brings to a head, to a very, very concentrated, clear place, your entire need to understand, the need to be oriented, the need to make sense of things, is like brought right to a head by banging yourself against this issue. And once it's been highlighted and made very, very clear what the pain and the need associated with coming to an answer is, then you can break through that need, the drivenness to understand. So the purpose of the koan is to highlight your need to understand, and then you break through the drivenness to understand, and that's how you solve the koan. You do not get an answer to the koan. You get an answer as to why you need answers to begin with, to anything. And that is to say, you break through the drivenness to understand. Now, what do you think happens to a person's consciousness once they are no longer compulsive about understanding? Anybody in this room compulsive about understanding? Like, have any compulsions like the need to understand the words I'm saying now? Maybe the words I'm saying now are starting not to make any sense. Okay? What about that need to get something out of this talk, to have it be productive, to have it make sense, to be logically oriented? What will happen to a person's state of consciousness when they are no longer gobbling at reality the way a compulsive eater gobbles at food? The mind, it's the purpose of the mind to digest reality, okay? To dine on reality. The thinking mind is supposed to dine on reality. Instead, it gobbles, okay? True or false? Those of you that have sat know. If you've ever sat still, you'll see. There is a tremendous compulsive drivenness to understand, to make sense, to keep logical continuity. You may be, as I say, you may be feeling it right now as I get a little further out in my talk. Okay, what happens to a person's consciousness when they have, to a certain extent, worked through the need to understand, the need to know? Do they stop understanding and stop knowing? Yes or no? No. What happens to a person when they have worked through the compulsion to eat? Do they stop eating? No, they stop gobbling and they start dining and appreciating the food. And in the same way, when a person has worked through the compulsion to understand, then they the mind stops grabbing onto reality and starts to dine on reality. That is to say, that person's consciousness is converted from a need to know to an intuitive spiritual way of knowing. So what the koan does is it brings right to the surface the drivenness to understand. You break through that drivenness, and then you don't need to understand so much anymore, and lo and behold, understandings start to happen to you. Intuition starts to flow through you. So the koan is something that brings an issue to a head where you can see it. It becomes very highlighted, very clear, and then you work through and a transcendence takes place. I would suggest to you that a person that has in their life a certain issue of compulsion or phobia has what in the Buddhist tradition is called genjo koan, a ready-made koan, a natural koan that's been supplied to you. Remember, when you solve your koan in Zen practice, you, quote, get enlightenment. So from this perspective, the person that has a real issue of compulsiveness around this or that, or a real phobia in their life, has all the blocks to complete spiritual fulfillment concentrated in one spot, where it is rather compact and convenient to break through. So from a certain perspective, that person is fortunate. First of all, they're fortunate because if they want to live even a normal life, they have to break through. And secondly, they're fortunate because since everything is concentrated right there, it's like easy to see what is blocking complete spiritual fulfillment. It's that issue. So from one perspective, it's very tragic to have a major compulsion. From another perspective, it can be looked upon as very fortunate if that person is equipped with certain tools. I would like to suggest to you today, or describe to you today, one possible set of meditative tools for dealing with this issue. This is only one possible strategy among many. So I want you to understand it within that context. It is, however, a strategy that I am most familiar with, and therefore I will share it with you. According to this particular strategy, one passes through a sequence of states in the process of transcending a compulsion. The first state is a really pathetic one. That is the state where the person is completely at the mercy of the compulsion. And they perceive of the compulsion in terms of, I have a problem with food. Let's just use the word food. We could just as easily say cocaine or whatever. Or I have a problem with this person, or I have a problem with this situation. At that stage, that first stage, the person is utterly at the mercy of the drivenness, and the problem is projected as something external. Everybody familiar with that stage? Okay. If the person can't move beyond that stage, then it's virtually a hopeless situation. At the second stage, again, I want to emphasize this is just one approach among many possible approaches. With this approach, at the second stage, the person is able to some degree to associate feelings with the problem situation. Okay? In other words, they can actually contact feeling. Now, what do I mean by feeling? The word feeling in English is very ambiguous, because if I ask you, tell me about your feelings, chances are you will interpret that to mean tell me your ideas about something. Isn't that interesting? Right? This is the way I feel about this. This is wrong with it, and I like this, and if this happens, this other thing will also happen. Those are all ideas. What I just described doesn't have anything at all to do with feeling. That's concepts, okay? So when we use in the colloquial sense this idea of share your feelings or whatever, a lot of times we're talking about ideas and concepts. That's not feeling, okay? You want to get an idea of what feeling is? Babies have feeling. Do they have much concept? Not a whole lot. They don't have internal conversations with themselves. They don't have too much past or future, too much memory, right? But do they have feeling? Yes or no? They're all feeling, right? Feeling is primitive. It is primordial. It is the experience of ouch, okay? Or it is the experience of okay? Pleasure and pain. That's feeling, okay? Feeling in the adult is very, very mixed, of course, with the thinking process. But let's not confuse them, okay? Feeling is primordial, and if you want to look and observe feeling and make contact with feeling, I would suggest to you that one very useful strategy is to get contact with your body sensations. The body sensations, any body sensation, the touch of your clothes, okay, the air going by you, the beating of your heart, any body sensation is an arrow that points you in the direction of pure feeling. If you want to know where to look, if I were to say, you know, we have this great phrase like get in contact with your feelings, right? Where do you look? Okay, if I want to point a direction, you have to have a pointer, like look over there, look over there. Where do you look to get in contact with your feelings? Do you look into your concepts about the way things should be or shouldn't be? Do you look into your ideas about the way you are or aren't today? That's not the direction to look for feeling. One arrow that points to feeling is body sensation. Again, this is just one strategy. But when you are attending to body sensation, you are looking in the direction, you're looking down into primordial feeling, pleasure and pain. At the second stage of transcendence, the person is able to contact some of the feeling associated with the compulsion. Feelings come in basically two flavors called pleasant and unpleasant. There is, of course, you never thought of it in terms of flavor, okay? There's another flavor that's sort of neutral. And then there are many, many sub-flavors. You know about wine tasters? You ever hear wine tasters talking to each other? I don't know beans about wine. Some of you may know something about wine. But when I listen to wine tasters talking, they communicate with each other. They can talk for hours, and I can't understand a single word they're saying. But they are obviously communicating real experiences to each other, right? They're talking about different aromas and bouquets and fullness and ebullience, or all sorts of qualities, flavors, and aspects of wine experience that are just crystal clear to them, every one of those flavors, but are lost on me because I don't have the sensitivity to detect that kind of thing. I would suggest to you that in addition to the two basic flavors, pleasant and unpleasant, there are innumerable sub-flavors, a lot more than 31, okay, of actual feelings that we are subject to. At the second stage, the person is able to detect the pleasant or unpleasant or mixture of pleasant and unpleasant associated with the compulsion. What does that mean? It means when you observe your abstinence, let's say that you're dealing with the eating issue, you observe your abstinence for a while and you start to think, I just want to eat, I don't care, I just want. You're at the first stage. It's an urge, a driving urge, and that's all. I just gotta. Then if you start to pay attention though, you'll see, why do I just gotta? Well, if I don't, then I'm going to start to feel more of this discomfort. Okay? But where's the discomfort? What are the qualities of the discomfort? At the second stage, you start to get a sense of qualities and locations of the actual sensation associated with that urge. And in order to do that, you may have to be very patient and wait a long time and abstain and go into deep states of concentration and just feel the body until you can make that contact. Because usually the sensations that drive a person in a compulsive behavior are surrounded by clouds of ignorance, clouds of unconsciousness. And a person either has to somehow cut through that or simply patiently wait for the clouds to lift for even a short period of time. Maybe they'll be there all day, but for 5 minutes, the cloud of ignorance lifts, and you can actually feel some tangible pain associated with the need to binge, let us say. Now that pain is always there and felt by the unconscious. And the unconscious, in order to relieve itself as a coping mechanism for that pain, says, go eat. But ultimately, one is eating in order to relieve that pain. So at the second stage, you can feel the pain. It is also could happen, I should point out, that you may be sitting there fantasizing, gee, wouldn't it be great to, okay, and some pleasure comes in the body, but it's a very faint pleasure. The faint pleasure of the memories of having eaten or used a drug or something like that. And that is surrounded by a lot of ignorance too. It's very subtle. So you also have to be able to contact the memories of the pleasant experience. And what happens, okay, when that little bit of pleasure comes, if you cannot experience it with full consciousness, it won't be satisfying. And some part of the deep mind will say, I gotta have more of that, and in order to have more of that, better go eat, better go binge. So we are driven by pleasure and pain. More precisely, we are driven by pleasures that are not experienced fully and pains that are experienced with resistance. Okay? When you don't experience a pleasure fully, it's not satisfying. Theoretically, when you first think, wouldn't it be great too, and you think about your compulsion, at that moment enough pleasure fills your body the same that you could be just as satisfied as if you had engaged in the compulsion. Okay? But you have to be really aware of it and get complete fulfillment in that moment, and then there'll be no drivenness to go on to actually engage in the behavior. Or, on the other hand, you will feel the pain of the deprivation. If you can have a complete experience of that pain without resisting it, it will sort of bubble into energy and will lose its driving power. Okay? Actually, I've gotten a little ahead of myself. What I just described just now is actually the last stage. So maybe I better fill in the pictures. Okay? Fill in the gaps. At the first step, you can't feel anything. The second step, you feel something. And what you feel may be very vague. You may just feel, oh yeah, I get a hint of a little pressure in my chest. What's the big deal? Okay? Or yeah, I feel a little tension in my back when I feel like I have to eat or something like that. I would suggest to you that that little hint of something is the tip of an immense iceberg of feeling. Okay? And at the second stage, you may have to be satisfied with just a little hint. Some sort of actual feeling. It may not even be all that pleasant or unpleasant, but some tangible feeling associated with the compulsion. The best way to bring those feelings to the surface is abstinence. Okay? But abstinence with awareness and courage to feel, with that orientation, not abstinence for the sake of abstinence. Abstinence for the sake that it's going to bring the sensations to the surface. Again, this is just one strategy. At the third stage, you get a consistent, clear contact with the sensations associated with the drivenness. At that stage, that sensation will tend to fill your entire body and be with you all the time. Okay? And at that stage, you are willing that happen. So if it's an unpleasant sensation that is driving the behavior, you will feel that icky tension every part of your body, and it will just be there. And you will be there with it and willing to be there with it, so that you get a consistent contact and a clear contact with those sensations. That's stage number 3. At stage number 4, you have stayed with the sensation long enough and observed it carefully enough that you begin to see that, in fact, it has a quality of movement and change to it. Impermanence, we call it in Buddhism. In other words, it may seem very solid, but if you look patiently enough, you'll see that it's shifting a little from side to side, throbbing a little bit, vibrating, in some way or another circulating throughout your body. And the more you watch that quality of circulation, the more evident it becomes. And because of that, you're willing to sort of open up to it. Okay, it's like almost like energy moving through. You're willing to open up, and the more you open up, the more circulatory it becomes. And eventually what happens is that it no longer is experienced as something that can drive you. It is just experienced as actually a very peaceful, almost massaging, rocking, peaceful and yet dynamic energy that is flowing through your body, and it has lost its driving power. If it's a pleasant sensation, the fact that it has become complete means that there's no unfulfillment. If it's an unpleasant sensation, the fact that it's moving means that it never turns into a goad or a barrier for you. You can literally see right through it. And if it's pleasant and unpleasant mixed, you are transcending both simultaneously. And at that stage, things get very peaceful. The sense of drivenness goes away. The sense of fulfillment goes up. Sound good?
Yeah.
And the best is yet to come. The best is yet to come. You come to realize that that movement within you is sort of nature's digestion process for karma. Okay? Karma is undigested experience. The undigested experience causes the solidification of the self. And the movement of those very sensations, which were at one time the driving force of your compulsion, when they are experienced as energy that is moving through the body, as soon as that energy starts to move, it will move for a minute and then will hit a hard spot. And you'll feel it grind down or break down that hard spot, and you'll realize some rocky place in my personality has just been smoothed out. Some kink in the core of my being has been ironed out. You know how when you take an iron and you move it over cloth, it takes out all the wrinkles and kinks, okay? The movement of impermanence through a person, you actually begin to feel it literally taking out the knots and kinks and wrinkles at the very core of your personality, making you a softer, lighter, fluid being. And ultimately, the ultimate place that that process converges to is that you not only become fluid, you become, I don't want to scare you, but vaporous. That is to say, spirit. Okay, what does spirit mean? Okay, you become, in other words, you cease being a frozen thing, and you become an effortless activity. The totality of your being returns to being part of nature. Now, does that mean you're wimpy and namby-pamby? Oh, no. Okay. Just because drivenness is gone from your being doesn't mean that power is gone. Quite the opposite. The totality of your being becomes as effortless as the ripples spreading on a lake. Ever watch ripples spreading on a lake? There's a certain quality to them, isn't there? A certain charming, effortless, spontaneous, just happening quality. That quality begins to pervade down into every part of your perception and action. That is called the state of nirvana. Okay? But remember that the same effortless quality that characterizes ripples also characterizes an avalanche. Okay? There's no drivenness in an avalanche. It just happens. It's just as effortless as ripples on a lake. So don't think that you're going to become some sort of wimpy, ineffectual person. Okay? When something arises, the response will happen, and it may be as intense as an avalanche, but there's nothing driving it. It just happens because it's appropriate. That is called living the life of nirvana. At the final stage, you experience the movement and impermanence within yourself, the movement of this constant shifting within yourself. You actually feel it as an evolutionary force breaking up the knots, the blocks, at the deeper level of your personality and literally converting you into a different kind of substance, okay? Or a different phase of matter, like the difference between frozen water and fluid water. And so that's what we might call the final stage. Let us review. At the first stage, you're just driven. You can't feel anything at all. The second stage, you get at least some contact that this drivenness is associated with pleasant and unpleasant feelings. At the third stage, you are willing to have consistent contact. All the time, you're just hanging out with the feelings that drive you, and you're not engaging in the behavior. And you okay, that's number 3. Number 4, you're hanging out long enough that and patiently enough that you see that those feelings are really just changing energy. They're constantly moving. You focus on the movingness, and you focus away from the fact of pleasantness and unpleasantness. In other words, you are riding on the changing contour of pure feeling, and not so much caught in the content of feeling, but contour, the wave qualities, how it comes and goes, how it ebbs and flows, how it throbs and subsides. In what I just described, you have escaped into your feelings. Oh, it's extraordinary. You can have your cake and eat it too. You could be an ordinary human being, really in contact with your feelings, and at the same time, very, very much transcending. And then that energy takes you into deeper and deeper states of calm, peace, and at the same time you feel that movement pushing to the surface and breaking up the undigested, unresolved parts of your personality. And that could be called an experience of a consistent grace and consistent growth. In other words, growing literally feeling yourself growing every minute, because you feel some block to growth breaking up. If not every minute, at least every 5-10 minutes, okay? And you just hang out with that for the rest of your life, allowing that process to purify you and to carry you along. It's called entering the stream. The stream of nature just carries you. So this is the tremendous good news about applying the meditative process to a compulsive situation. The fact that a person has a pathological or severe compulsion or phobia simply means that those feelings are always there. They're always there for you to work on. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to go to retreats, okay? You don't have to see teachers. It's all there, okay? It's right there for you. You have a ready-made. The barrier to enlightenment has been presented to you clearly and is every day presented to you. And therefore, you can bore in, drill into the feelings associated with that, and eventually poke through to the state of transcendent awareness. One other practical remark that I would like to make with respect to this process. I told you the good news. There's another part to the bad news if you want to use this particular technique. One part of the bad news was that you have to work real hard, okay? And you have to really want it. There's another bad news part to it. What I'm describing to you is a healthy way to relate to feeling. It is a coping mechanism for pleasure and pain that allows you to have increased fulfillment in what is pleasurable and decreased suffering in what is painful. Unfortunately, the standard human coping mechanism for dealing with feelings is to sort of make the feelings vague and push them down and sort of ignore and in some way or another divert awareness from feeling. To blunt the intensity of feeling by in some way diverting awareness is the standard species-wide coping mechanism, okay, on this planet. The word I said unfortunately is unfortunately what I'm describing to you, you have probably figured out by now, is 180 degrees the opposite direction of the standard coping mechanism. Therefore, if you apply this kind of technique of when I said in the second stage you're going to get in contact with the sensations, okay, when you do that, those sensations are going to be huge. And you are going to need an external support network to prevent you from being overwhelmed by those sensations and going into worse behavior than you had before. Okay? So I'll repeat it again. Sometimes people cope and they can maintain some levels of abstinence by ignoring the sensations or diverting awareness from the sensations. But it's not abstinence without effort. Okay, it's a very difficult, superficial abstinence, and you haven't rooted out the cause, and you haven't experienced a transformation. But you've sort of coped by covering it over, or in some way by substituting some other less harmful compulsion, like you talk compulsively instead of eat compulsively. Sound familiar? Okay. Now, what the strategy I'm describing to you will do is, it is going to bring to the surface the pain, it's primarily pain, that is driving that compulsion. When that pain starts to percolate to the surface, unless you have an external support network or system or somebody that you're talking to or something to keep you in line, you may find that there will be a strong tendency for the behavior to get worse before it gets better. So from a practical point of view, if any of you are considering applying a strategy like what I'm describing to a severe compulsion, I would really encourage you to have people that you can rely on that will be helping you at the behavioral level. In other words, as you work at the source level, meditation works at the source level, but the source level involves feeling. And once you start touching feeling, you're dealing with something very primitive and very powerful, okay? And in order to, at the behavioral level, to keep things in line, most people are going to need some sort of support structure or difficulties are going to develop. The behavior may become worse, as I say, before it gets better. So that's just a practical thing that I'd like you to keep in mind. Okay, how a person goes about implementing what I just described is that you have to receive instruction from somebody that knows how to teach it. And basically what they will do is they will teach you first how to concentrate, probably by teaching you to concentrate on your breath. Once you've developed a little bit of concentration power, doesn't take too long, then they will show you how to focus your awareness on body sensations so that you start to detect the feelings associated with it. And you just be trained in different focusing techniques, different ways of experiencing the sensation so that you can get in contact with what's happening where, when, in terms of the feelings that drive the compulsion. And you would do this practice, say a half an hour each day or something. You'd sit down and you'd feel and explore those sensations. And then whenever during the day compulsiveness came up, you would try to pay attention to the sensations, try to experience them in a way where you're open to them and not fighting with them, so that you can begin to experience them as just flowing energy. And then the compulsion gradually breaks up. So that's how you would go about implementing this. You would be taught a sequence of focusing techniques that would get you in contact with the feeling and allow you to experience the feeling as impermanent energy. This is basically what I have to say on the topic of applying meditation to compulsive eating. Of course, you could just change the words, to compulsive anything. That's the interesting thing about meditation. Meditation is the general formula. It works for any specific problem. You just plug in the variables. So there's not a different solution for a cocaine addict than for a compulsive eater. It's the same solution. You get them in contact with the feelings. You get them willing to feel the feelings once they contact it. When they're willing to feel the feelings, they can then see that the feelings are impermanent energy. At that point, the driving force in the feelings starts to break up, and in addition, that energy starts to feel like something that's really helping you along in your evolution. It works for anything. So that's, I think, all of the things I had to say on the topic. I have time for maybe one or two questions, and I'll start with Joe.
So when someone comes to you and they've been paying attention to the sensations that are getting intensified and they feel this craving and addiction much more intensely, can you say more about what you do specifically with them? What do you tell them? What do you actually do?
Well, usually what they need at that time is they need somebody to sit down with them and remind them how to meditate. That's what I do typically. Somebody comes to me with that, then I just talk to them for 10-15 minutes and have them pay attention to the impermanence of the sensation. And that reminder is usually enough. They already know how to do it, but they just had to be reminded. There's nothing all that special that I would do for a person that's experiencing the intensity, except perhaps sensitize them to the fact that the sensations are spreading throughout their whole body, that it's becoming global, and that they have to be willing to open up their whole body to it.
And really just encouraging them, giving them support and staying with them.
That's basically it, but that's 99% of my job. So, coach, sort of cheerleading and hand-holding, and, yes.
So what you're saying is if you feel, let's say, sorrow, and then you find in your body where you're feeling that sensation, that pain.
Right. Then you're at stage number 2. The next stage is stay with it consistently. Be willing that it is, after all, just a sensation in the body. Be willing that be everything and fill all your body space. And then that willingness, you'll see, means that the resistance to the sensation is dropping. As soon as the resistance to the sensation drops, it starts to flow a little bit. Feels better, okay? Then you say, okay, let's let it. You don't make it flow, but you say, okay, I'll accept it a little more, and you feel more flowing, and it feels better still. Sounds easy, but it does take effort. Yes, in the way.
Comment on how you deal with depression, which I found working with eating disorders, a lot of suppressed anger and unwillingness to feel or express
Ah, yes, okay. In exactly the same way. At first, they just say, I'm angry at so-and-so, or I'm angry. Instead of saying, I'm angry, you get them to the place where they can say, I feel a tightening in my knees, and I feel a shaking in my arms, and I feel a frustrating feeling in my chest, and I feel a hot flash over my head. Now, that's the same as saying I'm angry, except a lot more specific and detailed. That's stage number 2, the contact with the anger. Then willingness to see that as just moving energy through the body. It's the same. And your comment is very, very correct. Underneath the sadness, underneath the depression is rage. Underneath the rage is fear. Underneath the fear is more subtle depression, okay? Layer after layer like that has to be worked through. And sometimes a person can get on a roll, and they can actually pop through several in just one retreat. Sometimes it can take months and months just to contact one new layer. That was my comment about how meditation is sort of a very general principle. Again, I emphasize, this is just one technique of meditation, just one strategy, and I would never for a moment suggest that everybody should do this or has to do this. I'm just sharing one way that works, which we call Vedana Vipassana technically in the ancient language of India. The technique I just described to you is called transcendence through feeling. That's what Vedana Vipassana means. Vedana is pure sensation, and it's the clarification and transcendence. That's what Vipassana means, to see through by clarifying. So you see through by clarifying pure feeling. The reason I teach this technique is that it works very fast. It's very powerful. But the other side of the picture is it's very dangerous and very challenging. Because whenever you're getting down into what is primitive, you're dealing with powerful stuff. And just like when you get down to the level of the nucleus in the atom, then you've got atomic energy. That's powerful stuff. That's a lot more powerful than chemical energy, which is like dynamite, right? So if you start working at the level of a person's pure feeling, you're working at the level of atomic energy. So you have to be careful with those nuclear power plants, okay? But if they work right, they can really give you a lot of energy. You know, I figure, why not go for nuclear? I hope I'm not. This is in the spiritual realm. In the realm of politics, I'm anti-nuclear, okay? But in the realm of the spiritual, I say, well, let's go for the deep stuff. So it would be the same thing, exactly the same strategy. But your comment about underneath the depression is the anger, et cetera, is very important and very valid. But I just have them keep doing the same thing. See, that's what I like about this technique. It has a quality that I'm into mathematics, okay? Mathematicians like, which is consistency. You can consistently do the same thing no matter what comes up. Does that answer your question? Clarify it? It's a good question. Yes?
When you talk about this process being as easy as learning to play the piano pretty well, then I get hopeful. A lot of people who learn to play piano very well. When you talk about it as being as easy as living the life of nirvana or becoming enlightened, I don't know anybody who will say to me, oh yes, I'm enlightened, or I lived the life of nirvana. Which brings up actually a few questions for me. Do you know a lot of people who are enlightened?
At the first stages, it's not that uncommon. People that are engaged in a consistent meditative practice, where they know what they're doing and practice it consistently as part of their life, it is not uncommon to achieve the first stages of enlightenment, which we call entering the stream. But the total life of nirvana is relatively rare. I've only met a couple that I felt had achieved that. Actually, though, if you look back as to what I said, I actually didn't say easy or difficult. I said it takes the same amount of time and energy. Okay, so usually I choose my words carefully. About the same amount of time and energy that a person would put into playing the piano, you could, and actually I said that with respect to concentration power, which is the first stage, the preliminary to this process that I was describing. The quick answer to your question is, yes, there are enlightened people. They're around. I absolutely guarantee that you've had interaction with them. But they're probably enlightened only at the first stage. But I'll tell you, the first stage is awful good. Okay? I mean, let's put it this way. First stage means there may be 1% enlightened. Okay? But that 1% is enough to last you for a lifetime. Okay, and one little drop of it. It may be that a fully enlightened person is an ocean. Okay, but I promise you, one drop of enlightenment goes a long way. And there are lots of people that have at least that drop of enlightenment, lots of them, that are in consistent practice. It can also happen spontaneously to people that never meditate. But a lot of times the drop evaporates. So we don't really call that enlightenment. But if they're in a consistent practice, they can preserve it. Other questions? Yes.
Start telling yourself something different to change.
Okay. What you have now brought up is another aspect of meditation which deals with the clarification of the thinking process. All I've described today is the aspect of meditation that deals with the clarification of the feeling process. What you've just asked about is your ideas, your concepts. That's a whole other way to meditate, and that can be done along with the clarification of the feeling process, but it's not necessary. All you need to do is really take out the blocks to feeling, and your ideas about yourself will automatically become more healthy, you might say. That may not fully...
Getting to the root cause, just getting the basic feeling that you had
Well,
at the beginning, is that what you mean by the root cause?
yes, the root cause is not the feeling. The root cause is not the feeling, but one's habits around feeling. The habits of compressing feeling, that is to say, of pushing and pulling on feeling, and of diverting one's awareness from feeling. That is the root cause of suffering. So what we're doing is we're clarifying feeling. In doing that, that means that we're learning a new habit. We're learning how to experience feeling without pushing and pulling on it. And we're learning how to experience feeling without diverting ourselves in even the tiniest little way from it. The root cause of the suffering is not feeling, but the habits that surround feeling. So when I say clarify the feeling process, what I'm actually saying is cultivate new habits around feeling. There's actually no drivenness in feeling. There's only drivenness in one's reactions to feeling. Okay? Does that make sense? Okay, now very soon this room will be chock full of feelings. What kind of feelings? There will be the feelings associated with the need to get up, because most human beings can only sit still for about an hour. Okay? And after that, certain sensations come up, and they're coming up unconsciously first, but I can feel them. You may not be conscious of them yet, okay, but I can feel them just on the edges of consciousness starting to creep up in the entire room, okay? You might, as an experiment, try to locate and be aware of those, instead of just the idea, gee, I sure wish he'd stop talking, or I'd like to stretch, or, it's getting a little repetitive now, or, okay, those are ideas. Those are not your feelings. Your feelings is the little teeny microscopic tensions that are starting to diffuse through your body right now. Feel them? Okay? That is what is, quote, telling you, I gotta move. I just gotta change the scene somehow. Now, we're going to change the scene for you soon enough. After all, we would like you to come back and not look upon this place as some, torture chamber where you're made to sit for long periods of time. On the other hand, I have described for you a coping mechanism for those feelings. When I was in Japan, we used to have to sit in full lotus hours listening to lectures on very dry, scholastic Buddhist topics. Okay? This is how you listen to a lecture in the Japanese monastery, okay? Let's look at all the freedom you have. You can wiggle your back. Anyway, I will let you go, but first I have to deal with my own compulsion for a moment, that I have some announcements